Shelter's lights were turning off forever. The last cat story saved them all. The finger hovered over the light switch, trembling slightly as a single meow cut through the silence of the dimly lit corridor. It was as if the last cat was saying, "Don't turn it off just yet." Marlowe Finch paused, her hand suspended in mid-air. The overhead fluorescent light flickered, casting uncertain shadows across the worn linoleum floor of Harbour Haven Animal Shelter. The light had been faithful for 15 years, just like Marlowe herself, showing up day after day without fanfare or recognition. Now both seemed to be reaching their end. "I hear you, Quill," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tiredness that had settled deep in her bones. "Just one more night then." Marlowe's eyes, bordered by creases earned through years of early mornings and late nights, adjusted to the half-light as she looked down the corridor. Stacked cardboard boxes lined the walls, each labeled in her precise handwriting: files, supplies, donation jars. The air carried the sharp scent of disinfectant, masking 15 years of animal stories that had unfolded within these walls. At the end of the hallway sat Quill, a tabby cat with extraordinarily attentive eyes. Those eyes now watched Marlowe with a gaze that seemed to measure the exact distance between trust and injury. He had been at Harbour Haven longer than any other animal, passed over time and again by potential adopters who preferred kittens with playful antics or cats who sought affection more readily. Quill had his routines. Each day, he sat in the same corner at the same time, staring at the door as if rehearsing courage. When visitors came, he would watch with that careful gaze, never approaching but never fully retreating either. It was as if he wanted to belong, but feared what might come after, being chosen only to be returned when the novelty wore off. Outside, normal life continued on Harper Street in the small Massachusetts town of Millfield. Children with noisy backpacks streamed from the elementary school across the way. The Baptist church prepared for its Sunday community coffee. The self-service laundromat hummed steadily, its rhythm seeming to cradle the passing hours. Inside Harbour Haven, however, time was running out. The closing notice taped to the front door made it official. After 15 years of saving strays and finding homes for the abandoned, Harbour Haven Animal Shelter would close its doors forever in 30 days. The building's owner had doubled the rent, donations had dwindled to a trickle, and the volunteer base had shrunk to just Marlowe and a rotating cast of well-meaning but inconsistent helpers. "Well," Marlowe said, addressing both Quill and the empty room, "I suppose we should both get used to change." She walked over to where he sat, careful to move slowly. Quill watched her approach, but didn't flee. Progress of sorts. Marlowe crouched down, her knees protesting after a day spent packing files and sorting supplies. "What do you say we find you somewhere temporary, at least until we figure things out?" The shelter phone rang, startling them both. Quill's ears flattened against his head as Marlowe sighed and stood up. "Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow." "Harbour Haven, this is Marlowe," she answered, her professional voice taking over automatically. "Marlowe, it's Gerald from the bank." The voice on the other end sounded apologetic already. "About that extension you requested." As Marlowe listened to the final nail being driven into Harbour Haven's coffin, she watched Quill slip silently toward the window that overlooked Harper Street. He jumped onto the sill and sat perfectly still, his silhouette dark against the fading afternoon light. Outside, the church bell tolled 5 times, and right on cue, the recycling truck rumbled past. Quill's tail twitched once, marking the moment. Habit, routine, anchor. Even as everything around him was being dismantled, Quill held to his rituals with quiet dignity. "I understand," Marlowe finally said into the phone. "Thank you for trying." She hung up and walked to the window, standing beside Quill without touching him. Together they watched as steam escaped from the laundromat vents next door, curling into the cooling autumn air. "You know what, Quill? I think you'd better come home with me until we sort this out." The decision formed as she spoke it. "My apartment isn't much, but it's quiet. You might like the window there. It faces east." Quill yawned widely, seemingly indifferent to the momentous offer being extended. Marlowe found herself smiling despite everything. On impulse, she pulled out her phone and recorded a brief video of Quill's casual yawn against the backdrop of steam rising from the laundromat. Later that night, after posting the video to Harbour Haven's sparsely followed social media page with the caption, "Meet Quill, our last resident looking for a temporary home," Marlowe locked up the shelter. This time, she did turn off the lights, but not before making a promise to herself and to Quill. This wasn't the end, not yet. Not while there was still one cat watching the door, rehearsing courage. As she drove home with Quill secure in a carrier beside her, Marlowe couldn't have known that the simple video she'd posted, just 15 seconds of a tabby cat yawning as steam billowed in the background, would be the first thread in a tapestry of small miracles that was about to be woven on Harper Street. Marlowe's apartment above Thatcher's hardware store was exactly 17 steps up from the street level. Quill counted each one as Marlowe carried him inside the carrier, his body tense against the unfamiliar motion. The stairwell smelled of wood shavings and metal, different from the clinical scent of Harbour Haven, but not entirely unpleasant. "Home sweet home," Marlowe announced as she unlocked her door. "It's not fancy, but it's warm." The small apartment was neat, but clearly lived in. Books stacked on coffee tables, a quilt draped over a worn armchair, and plants occupying every available windowsill suggested a life built around comfort rather than appearances. Marlowe set the carrier down gently in the living room and opened its door. "Take your time," she said, moving away to give Quill space. "I'll be in the kitchen making tea if you need anything." Quill remained motionless in the carrier, his eyes scanning every corner of this new territory. The windows were larger than those at Harbour Haven, and one indeed faced east as Marlowe had promised. The hardwood floor creaked slightly under her steps as she moved to the kitchen, a sound that reminded Quill of the shelter's night watchman who used to check on the animals after hours. It took 27 minutes before Quill ventured out of the carrier. By then, Marlowe had settled into her armchair with a cup of tea and a folder of Harbour Haven's financial records spread across her lap. She pretended not to notice as he carefully explored the perimeter of the room, pausing to sniff at the baseboard heater and the potted spider plant. "The heat works better here than at the shelter," Marlowe commented without looking directly at him. "That old boiler at Harbour Haven has been limping along for years. I don't know why I bother mentioning it in the closing inventory. It's practically an antique." As if responding to her words, Quill approached the radiator and settled beside it, his body a careful distance from both the heat source and Marlowe herself. Trust, like warmth, would have to build gradually. Morning found Quill perched on the windowsill that faced east, watching as golden light spilled over the rooftops of Millfield. Marlowe, dressed in her Harbour Haven volunteer shirt despite it being her day off, placed a small dish of food nearby. "I'm heading to the shelter to continue packing," she explained as she gathered her keys and purse. "There's a church coffee after the service, and Reverend Greer said I could put up a notice about adoption events. Not that anyone will come, but—" She shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. Quill merely blinked, his gaze shifting between Marlowe and the window where he could see the Harper Street clock tower in the distance. "I'll be back before dark," Marlowe promised. As she opened the door to leave, she paused. "Maybe I'll bring your window perch from the shelter. Would you like that?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but not unheard. Marlowe smiled slightly and closed the door behind her. The Sunday church coffee at First Baptist was a Millfield tradition that predated most of its attendees. Tables laden with pumpkin pie and coffee urns that had seen decades of use occupied the fellowship hall. The scent of fresh brewed coffee mingled with the woody polish used on the pews, creating a distinctively comforting atmosphere. Marlowe stood by the community bulletin board, pinning up a notice about Harbour Haven's closing and the need for adopters or fosters. Her fingers felt clumsy with the pushpins, a physical manifestation of the emotion she was trying to keep at bay. "Marlowe, I was hoping to catch you," called a warm voice from across the room. Reverend Thomas Greer, a man whose silver hair and gentle demeanor had guided the congregation for over 20 years, approached with 2 coffee cups in hand. He offered one to Marlowe, who accepted it gratefully. "Thomas, thank you for letting me put up the notice," she said, gesturing to the bulletin board. "Of course, but I wanted to talk to you about something else." He nodded toward an empty table in the corner. "Do you have a moment?" They settled at the table, steam rising from their cups as elderly women in wool coats moved between the pie tables, comparing recipes in hushed tones. Nearby, a group of men discussed the town's water bill increase with the seriousness usually reserved for international diplomacy. "I saw your post last night," Reverend Greer said, "the one with the cat yawning." Marlowe blinked in surprise. "You follow Harbour Haven's page?" "My granddaughter set up notifications for me. She's trying to get me with the times, as she puts it." He smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. "But that's not important. What struck me was how that cat, Quill is it, seemed so calm despite everything changing around him." Marlowe nodded, warming her hands on the coffee cup. "He's always been like that. Watchful, steady. He sits at the same window at the same time every day. When the church bell rings at noon and the recycling truck passes, he's always there, just observing. Like clockwork, Reverend Greer mused. You know, that reminds me of something. Our seniors ministry has been looking for a way to connect with the homebound members. Something about routine and companionship. He trailed off, his eyes focusing on something beyond the fellowship hall. What if you brought Quill to our community coffee next Sunday? Marlowe's expression must have revealed her skepticism, because Reverend Greer quickly continued. Just hear me out. Many of our older members had pets all their lives but can't care for them now. They miss that connection, and if this cat is as calm as you say, it might be a bright spot in their week. Plus, it could draw attention to the shelter's situation. Marlowe sipped her coffee, considering. I don't know, Thomas. Quill isn't exactly a therapy cat. He's cautious around strangers. So are most people worth knowing, the Reverend replied with a gentle smile. Just think about it, will you? Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference. As Marlowe drove back to the shelter, her mind kept returning to Reverend Greer's suggestion. Harbour Haven needed a miracle, or at least a significant boost in community support, if there was any hope of finding homes for the remaining animals, or possibly relocating to a more affordable space. The shelter was quiet when she arrived, the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the windows. Marlowe moved methodically through the task she'd set for herself, sorting medical records, cataloguing supplies, preparing adoption packets that might never be used. The work was necessary, but felt increasingly futile. When she reached Quill's former enclosure, Marlowe paused. The window perch where he'd spent countless hours watching Harper Street was still there, worn smooth by years of use. She unbolted it carefully, noting how dust had accumulated in the corners where the perch met the wall, evidence of how long Quill had claimed this spot as his own. As she worked, her phone chimed with a notification. Expecting another bill reminder, Marlowe was surprised to see it was from Harbour Haven's social media page. 12 new shares on your post. Curious, she opened the app to find that her simple video of Quill yawning had been shared not only by Reverend Greer, but by several other community members, including Keen Dillard from the local radio station and Rhea Yarrow, the elementary school principal. Under Rhea's share was a comment that made Marlowe stop and reread it twice. Is this the same cat I see in the shelter window when I leave school? The one that watches the clock tower? We should talk. I have an idea for our reading program. For the first time in weeks, Marlowe felt a flicker of something that resembled hope. She looked around at the half-packed boxes and the closing notice that seemed to mock her efforts. Perhaps Reverend Greer was right. Sometimes the smallest things did make the biggest difference. That evening, as Marlowe returned to her apartment with Quill's window perch tucked under her arm, she found him sitting precisely where she'd left him that morning, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. When she installed the perch on her eastern window, he approached it cautiously, sniffing each corner as if verifying its authenticity. It's the same one, Marlowe assured him. A little piece of home. To her surprise, Quill jumped onto the perch and settled into his familiar position, his body relaxing incrementally as he recognized the contours that had supported him through countless watch sessions at Harbour Haven. As night fell over Millfield, Marlowe sat at her small dining table with her laptop open, creating a spreadsheet titled Community Connections. At the top, she typed 3 names: Reverend Thomas Greer, Rhea Yarrow, and Keen Dillard. Beneath these, she added, Sunday coffee visit and school reading program. From his perch, Quill watched her work, his eyes reflecting the blue light of the screen. Outside, the church bell tolled 8 times, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded. New routines in a changing world. Marlowe looked up from her planning to find Quill staring at her with those attentive eyes. What do you think? She asked him. Are you ready to become Millfield's most famous cat? Quill blinked slowly, which Marlowe chose to interpret as consent. She reached for her phone and took another short video of him sitting regally on his perch against the backdrop of Millfield's twinkling lights. This time, she added a caption that was both a question and a declaration. The last cat of Harbour Haven is looking for friends. Are you one of them? As she posted it to the shelter's page, Marlowe couldn't have known that across town, people were already talking about the quiet tabby with the watchful eyes, the cat who sat by the window as if waiting for something important to happen. And perhaps in its own small way it already had. Sunday morning dawned crisp and bright, the kind of autumn day that painted Millfield in shades of amber and gold. Marlowe stood in her living room, second-guessing herself as she eyed the wicker basket she'd borrowed from Harbour Haven storage. "This is probably a terrible idea," she muttered, smoothing the small blanket she'd placed inside the basket. "What if you hate it? What if you run away? What if someone's allergic?" From his perch by the window, Quill observed her nervousness with characteristic composure. The morning light caught in his amber eyes, making them appear almost golden against his tabby markings. "The thing is," Marlowe continued, pacing now, "we need people to care about Harbour Haven before it's too late, and for some reason, they seem interested in you." She stopped and faced him directly. No pressure or anything. Getting Quill into the carrier had always been a challenge at the shelter. Today, however, when Marlowe placed it beside his perch with the door open, he surprised her by walking in after only a brief hesitation. She blinked in astonishment before quickly securing the door. "Well," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips, "I'll take that as a yes." First Baptist Church was already buzzing with activity when Marlowe arrived. The fellowship hall smelled of pumpkin pie, fresh coffee, and the wool coats that had been hung on the rack by the door. Elderly women arranged plates of homemade cookies, while men set up folding chairs in a loose circle near the windows, where the morning light was strongest. Reverend Greer spotted Marlowe immediately and hurried over, his eyes brightening when he saw the carrier. "You brought him! Excellent," he said, keeping his voice low as he peered into the carrier. "I've already mentioned it to a few of our seniors. They're quite looking forward to meeting him." Marlowe nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Just remember, he's not used to crowds, and will need a quiet corner where he can retreat if it gets overwhelming." "Already taken care of," Reverend Greer assured her, guiding her toward a small alcove with a cushioned bench beneath a stained glass window. "We thought this would be perfect. It's out of the main traffic but still visible." As Marlowe set up Quill's temporary space, arranging the borrowed blanket on the bench and placing a small dish of water nearby, she was acutely aware of the curious glances being cast her way. When she finally opened the carrier door, she held her breath. Quill emerged cautiously, his nose twitching as he catalogued the new scents. He surveyed the room with those watchful eyes before settling on the blanket, his posture alert but not alarmed. "Well, I'll be," said a voice behind Marlowe. "Is this the famous window watcher from your video?" Marlowe turned to find Eliza Whitfield, a woman in her 80s whose white hair was arranged in an immaculate bun, peering at Quill with genuine interest. Despite her age, Eliza's blue eyes were sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses that had been in style several decades ago. "Yes, this is Quill," Marlowe confirmed, surprised by the recognition. "You've seen the video. My granddaughter showed it to me on her phone thing," Eliza explained, waving her hand dismissively. "Said the whole town was talking about the cat that keeps time better than the clock tower." She moved closer, her steps measured but steady. "May I?" Marlowe nodded, watching carefully as Eliza approached Quill. To her surprise, the elderly woman didn't immediately try to pet him. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bench at a respectful distance, regarding him with the patience of someone who understood that worthwhile connections couldn't be rushed. "Hello there," Eliza said softly. "You're quite the handsome fellow, aren't you?" Quill blinked slowly at her, his tail curled neatly around his paws. After a moment of mutual assessment, he stretched forward slightly, allowing his nose to come within inches of Eliza's outstretched hand, without quite touching it. "He likes you," Marlowe said, somewhat amazed. "He doesn't usually approach strangers." Eliza smiled, the creases around her eyes deepening. "We're not strangers. We're just friends who haven't properly met yet." She turned her attention back to Quill. "Isn't that right, young man?" Over the next hour, a steady stream of congregants made their way to the alcove. Some merely observed Quill from a distance, nodding appreciatively at his calm demeanor. Others, emboldened by Eliza's example, sat quietly nearby, speaking in low voices about pets they had loved and lost over the years. Harold Jenkins, a retired postal worker whose hands bore the evidence of decades sorting mail, shared stories about the cats who had greeted him on his route. "There was one orange fellow on Maple Street who knew the sound of my truck," he recalled, a wistful smile crossing his weathered face. "Rain or shine, he'd be waiting on the porch at exactly 10:15. Margaret Dawson, whose arthritis had confined her to a walker, spoke of the comfort her late husband's cat had brought her in the lonely months after his passing. "That cat knew when I was having a bad day before I did," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Would sit right on my lap when the pain was worst, purring like a little motor." As Marlowe listened to these stories, she was struck by how many revolved around routine and presence, the same qualities that made Quill special. He wasn't affectionate in the conventional sense, but his steady watchfulness and quiet dignity seemed to resonate deeply with these older adults who valued consistency in a world that changed too rapidly around them. Reverend Greer approached as the fellowship hour was winding down, his expression pleased but thoughtful. "This has been quite successful," he said quietly to Marlowe. "Better than I expected, actually." Marlowe nodded, glancing over to where Quill was now allowing Eliza to gently stroke his head, his eyes half closed in what appeared to be contentment. "I've never seen him this comfortable with strangers." "I've been thinking," Reverend Greer continued. "Our church has a small discretionary fund for community outreach. It's not much, but—" he hesitated. "The thing is, several members have approached me about making donations to Harbor Haven. They're asking what you need most urgently." Marlowe's throat tightened unexpectedly. "The boiler," she said without hesitation. "It's practically dead. And with winter coming—" She stopped, collecting herself. "But honestly, Thomas, the situation is more complicated than a broken boiler. The rent increase, the declining donations, the building code violations we can't afford to fix." Reverend Greer nodded, his expression understanding. "Start with the boiler," he advised. "Sometimes solving one problem creates space to address the others. And Marlowe," he gestured toward the seniors who were reluctantly saying goodbye to Quill, "you've given them something today, a connection, a bright spot. That matters." As Marlowe prepared to leave, Eliza Whitfield approached her once more, this time with a small envelope in her age-spotted hand. "For the shelter," she said firmly, pressing the envelope into Marlowe's palm. "It's not much, but it's regular. Same amount first Sunday of every month." Her blue eyes held Marlowe's gaze steadily. "But I have conditions." Marlowe blinked in surprise. "Conditions?" "Monthly reports," Eliza stated, as if it were perfectly reasonable. "And clear goals. I may be old, but I didn't manage my Herbert's hardware store for 40 years without learning about accountability." Despite everything, Marlowe found herself smiling. "That sounds fair, Mrs. Whitfield." "Eliza," the elderly woman corrected, "and bring that cat back next Sunday. He's good for my blood pressure." With that, she patted Marlowe's arm and walked away with the dignity of someone who had made an investment and expected it to be properly managed. That evening, as Marlowe prepared financial reports and labeled storage containers in the back room of Harbor Haven, she found herself working with renewed purpose. The envelope from Eliza, along with several others collected by Reverend Greer, sat on her desk, modest but meaningful contributions toward the shelter's survival. Quill, exhausted from his social debut, slept on a borrowed blanket nearby, his breathing deep and even in the chill that the failing boiler couldn't quite dispel. Tomorrow, Marlowe would call Hollis Pike, the town's most reliable plumber, who also sang baritone in the church choir. Perhaps he'd know if the old boiler could be revived one more time. As she worked late into the night, creating spreadsheets and setting clear, measurable goals as Eliza had requested, Marlowe couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted today. It wasn't a miracle. The shelter was still closing. The boxes still needed to be packed. The animals still needed homes. But for the first time in months, she felt as if she weren't facing these challenges entirely alone. In the quiet of the shelter's back room, with only the sounds of Quill's steady breathing and the occasional ping of the cooling boiler for company, Marlowe allowed herself to hope, just a little, that the last light might stay on a bit longer than expected. Principal Rhea Yarrow's office at Millfield Elementary smelled of cinnamon tea and new pencils. The walls were lined with children's artwork, colorful and exuberant, creating a stark contrast to the precise organization of her desk, where files were arranged in perfect alignment with the edge of the blotter. Marlowe sat uncomfortably in a chair clearly designed for someone smaller, Quill's carrier resting on the floor beside her. Through the office window, she could see children in bright coats racing around the playground, their shouts muffled by the glass. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Rhea said, her voice gentle but precise. She was a woman who spoke softly by choice rather than temperament, having learned that quiet words demanded more attention than loud ones, especially in a building filled with children. "Your message intrigued me," Marlowe admitted, "though I'm not sure how Harbor Haven fits into a reading program." Rhea smiled, the expression warming her otherwise serious face. "Have you heard of reading to dogs programs? They're quite successful in many schools." Marlowe nodded. "I've read about them. Children who struggle with reading gain confidence by reading aloud to non-judgmental listeners, usually therapy dogs." "Exactly," Rhea confirmed. "We've wanted to implement something similar here, but allergies, logistics, and budget constraints have been obstacles." She leaned forward slightly. Then I saw your video of Quill, and it got me thinking. Firecat might be even better for our purposes. Quieter, less intimidating for our more anxious readers. Marlowe glanced down at the carrier, where Quill was waiting with his characteristic patience. I'm not sure Quill is the right fit. He's not exactly trained for this kind of work. But that's just it, Rhea countered. From what I've observed and from your videos, he has exactly the temperament we need. Calm, patient, not demanding of attention. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Our librarian, Mrs. Chen, has a particular student in mind, Kala Wynn. Brilliant girl, but she struggles terribly with reading aloud. Stutters, loses her place, gets frustrated. Traditional interventions haven't helped much. Marlowe considered this, trying to imagine Quill in a library setting. And you think reading to a cat would help? I think reading to this specific cat might help this specific child, Rhea clarified. Would you be willing to try? Just once, as an experiment. Before Marlowe could respond, a knock at the office door interrupted them. A woman with salt and pepper hair in a practical bob poked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, Rhea, but Kala is ready whenever you are. She's waiting in the reading corner. Rhea nodded. Thank you, Vivian. We'll be right there. She turned back to Marlowe, eyebrows raised in question. Marlowe hesitated only briefly before nodding. One session, she agreed. We'll see how it goes. The school library was a wonderland of color and light, with book-filled shelves creating cozy nooks throughout the space. In one corner, a circular rug printed with the alphabet created a designated reading area, complete with beanbag chairs and cushions. A small girl with dark braids sat cross-legged on the rug, a book clutched tightly in her hands. She looked up as they approached, her eyes widening at the sight of the cat carrier. Kala, this is Ms. Finch from Harbour Haven Animal Shelter, Rhea introduced them softly. And this is Quill. They've come to visit our reading corner today. Kala nodded solemnly but didn't speak, her gaze fixed on the carrier. Marlowe knelt down to her level, setting the carrier on the rug. Would you like to meet Quill? She asked. Another nod, this one accompanied by a flicker of interest in the girl's dark eyes. Marlowe opened the carrier door, stepping back to give Quill space to emerge on his own terms. Everyone watched in silence as he cautiously exited, his whiskers twitching as he assessed this new environment. To Marlowe's surprise, Quill showed no signs of distress. He surveyed the library calmly before settling himself on the alphabet rug, directly on the letter Q, a coincidence that made Mrs. Chen smile appreciatively. Hello, Kala managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Quill blinked at her slowly, his posture relaxed but attentive. Would you like to read your book to Quill? Rhea suggested gently. Cats are excellent listeners. Kala looked uncertainly between the adults and the cat, before nodding again. She opened her book, a simple story about a mouse's adventure, and began to read. Once upon a time, she started, her voice catching on nearly every word. Her small fingers gripped the book so tightly that her knuckles whitened with the effort. Quill, seemingly oblivious to her struggle, settled more comfortably on the rug, his breathing deep and even. He neither demanded her attention nor showed impatience with her halting progress. He simply was, a calm presence in her moment of challenge. As Kala continued, something remarkable began to happen. Her stutter, while still present, became less pronounced. When she reached a particularly difficult passage, she would glance at Quill, whose steady gaze never wavered, and find the courage to continue. By the time she reached the final page, Kala was reading with greater fluency than Marlowe had thought possible, based on how she'd begun. When she closed the book, a small, triumphant smile played at the corners of her mouth. Very good, Kala, Mrs. Chen praised softly. That's the most smoothly you've read that story yet. Kala didn't respond to the librarian. Instead, she addressed Quill directly. Did you like the story? Quill, as if understanding the importance of the moment, stretched slightly and then settled back into his relaxed posture, blinking slowly at her once more. Kala's smile widened. I think he did, she declared, with more confidence than she'd shown throughout the entire reading. As they prepared to leave, Rhea pulled Marlowe aside while Mrs. Chen helped Kala select another book for next time. That was even more successful than I'd hoped, the principal said, her typically reserved demeanor giving way to genuine enthusiasm. Would you consider making this a regular arrangement? The school has a small budget for enrichment programs. Marlowe watched as Kala crouched beside Quill's carrier, whispering something to him before he was secured inside. I think we'd both like that, she replied. But Rhea, there's something you should know. Harbour Haven is closing at the end of the month. We've lost our lease and— I've heard, Rhea interrupted gently. Reverend Greer mentioned it at the last town council meeting. She paused, thinking. The school library is closed on Sundays. Perhaps you could use it for adoption events until you find a new location. Marlowe blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected offer. That's very generous, but it's not generosity, it's practicality, Rhea corrected, though her smile softened the words. You've just witnessed what your shelter, what Quill can offer our students. I'd like to formalize this arrangement with a proper contract. The school will pay a small stipend for regular reading sessions, and in exchange you'll need to provide health certificates for any animals who visit. As they walked back through the colorful hallways of Millfield Elementary, Marlowe found herself mentally rearranging her spreadsheets and timelines. The school's support wouldn't save Harbour Haven on its own, but combined with the church donations and perhaps other community partnerships yet to be discovered, it created possibilities where before there had been only dead ends. Outside, the autumn wind scattered red and gold leaves across the playground. Calla, now in line with her class, waved shyly as Marlowe passed. In the carrier, Quill watched the children with his usual calm attention, seemingly unaware that he had just opened another door that might help keep Harbour Haven's lights on. That evening, as Marlowe updated her Community Connections spreadsheet to include Millfield Elementary reading program, her phone chimed with a text from Rhea Yarrow. Health certificates on file with the district need to be updated annually. Our school nurse can assist if needed. Also, Calla asked when Quill would return. I told her next Tuesday. Hope that works for your schedule. Marlowe smiled at the principal's characteristic blend of practicality and thoughtfulness. She texted back a confirmation before turning to Quill, who was watching her from his window perch. Looks like you've got a job, Mr. Quill, she told him. Literacy coach. It comes with benefits. The school has heat that actually works. Quill's ear twitched, perhaps acknowledging the humor, perhaps simply tracking a sound from the street below. Outside, the recycling truck made its evening rounds, its familiar rumble a reminder that even as some things changed, others maintained their steady rhythm. Quill's eyes tracked its movement until it disappeared around the corner. Marlowe's phone rang, interrupting the moment. The screen displayed Harbour Haven, meaning someone was calling the shelter's landline that forwarded to her cell after hours. Harbour Haven. This is Marlowe, she answered, automatically adopting her professional tone. Miss Finch? This is Hollis Pike. Reverend Greer gave me your number. The man's deep voice had the slight echo that suggested he was in a large open space. I understand you've got boiler troubles. Marlowe's pulse quickened. Hollis Pike was Millfield's most reliable plumber, but also its most expensive. That's right, but I should warn you that our budget is extremely limited right now. Hollis chuckled, the sound warm and resonant. So the Reverend mentioned, I'm at choir practice now, but I could stop by tomorrow after my regular jobs. No charge for the assessment. After ending the call with profuse thanks, Marlowe sat back in her chair, feeling a peculiar mix of gratitude and wariness. The community's sudden interest in Harbour Haven was encouraging but also bittersweet. Where had this support been for the past year, as donations dwindled and volunteers disappeared? Better late than never, I suppose, she said to Quill, who had returned to grooming himself with methodical precision. Though a little earlier might have been nice. The next morning found Marlowe at Harbour Haven earlier than usual, armed with a thermos of coffee and a determination to make the shelter presentable before Hollis Pike's visit. The autumn chill had seeped into the building overnight, making her breath visible in the office where the broken boiler's influence didn't reach. She had just finished clearing a path to the utility room when she heard knocking at the front door. Through the glass, she could see a tall man with broad shoulders and work boots so worn they'd taken on the exact shape of his feet. Mr. Pike, she called, unlocking the door. You're early. Job in Westville cancelled, he explained, stepping inside and removing his cap to reveal silver-streaked dark hair. And please, it's Hollis. Mr. Pike was my father, and he was a miserable old coot who charged extra if you called him Mr. Despite her fatigue, Marlowe found herself smiling. The boiler's this way, she said, leading him toward the back of the building. Hollis followed, his footsteps surprisingly light for a man of his size. As they passed the now empty enclosures, he paused, glancing around. Place seems quiet. Most of the animals have been adopted or transferred to other shelters, Marlowe explained, trying to keep her voice neutral. We're down to just Quill, and he's staying with me temporarily. The famous window watcher, Hollis nodded. My daughter showed me those videos. Says the whole town's talking about him. So I've heard, Marlowe replied, still somewhat bemused by Quill's unexpected celebrity. The utility room was small and cluttered, dominated by an ancient boiler that wheezed and clanked even when not properly functioning. Hollis approached it with the reverence of someone greeting an elderly relative. "Well, hello there, old girl," he murmured, running his hand over the boiler's flank. "Let's see what's troubling you." For the next 30 minutes, Marlowe watched as Hollis conducted a thorough examination, occasionally asking questions about the boiler's history and maintenance schedule. His large hands moved with surprising delicacy as he tested valves and checked connections. Finally, he straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag pulled from his back pocket. "Good news and bad news," he announced. "Bad news is she's old, ancient really. Parts are hard to come by, and she's running at maybe 40% efficiency on her best day." Marlowe nodded, having expected as much. "And the good news? She's not dead yet," Hollis said with a slight smile. "With some creative repairs and regular maintenance, she could last another winter. Not ideal, but possible." "How creative are we talking?" Marlowe asked cautiously. Hollis scratched his chin thoughtfully. "I've got some compatible parts from a similar model I replaced at the Andersons last month. Kept them, because you never know when an old girl like this might need a transplant." He patted the boiler affectionately. "If you're amenable, I could bring them by after choir practice tomorrow. Should have her breathing easier by Thursday." Marlowe's relief was tempered by practicality. "That's incredibly generous, Hollis, but I can't accept free work. Harbor Haven may be struggling, but we still pay our bills." Hollis regarded her steadily, his expression neither offended nor surprised. "How about this? I'll do the labor as a donation. You pay for any additional parts we need beyond what I've salvaged, and you promise to implement a proper maintenance schedule going forward. This old girl deserves better care than she's been getting." It was a fair compromise, and more generous than Marlowe had dared hope. "Deal," she agreed, extending her hand, which disappeared into his much larger one when they shook on it. As they walked back to the front of the shelter, Hollis paused by the community bulletin board where Marlowe had posted upcoming adoption events and needs. "Says here you're looking for volunteers," he noted, reading the notice. "What kind?" Marlowe sighed, the weight of Harbor Haven's multiple challenges settling back on her shoulders. "Any kind, honestly. We're down to a skeleton crew, mostly just me and a few irregular helpers. For the adoption events, we need people to handle paperwork, supervise meet and greets, transport animals." "I'm handy with paperwork," Hollis offered. "Not just pipes. Did all the accounting for my business until it got too big last year." He shrugged as if embarrassed by his success. "Could help with that side of things if it'd be useful." By the time Hollis left, promising to return the next evening, Marlowe had not only secured help for the boiler, but gained a volunteer for Sunday's adoption event at the church. As she watched his truck pull away from the curb, she felt a cautious optimism taking root alongside her chronic exhaustion. That afternoon, Marlowe received a call from Keen Dillard at WMIL, Millfield's local radio station. His resonant voice was immediately recognizable to anyone who had lived in the area for more than a week. "Miss Finch, Keen Dillard here, morning host at WMIL and fan of your tabby timekeeper." Marlowe smiled despite herself. "Hello, Mr. Dillard. What can I do for you?" "Please, it's Keen to friends and listeners alike," he insisted cheerfully. "And it's what I can do for you that I'm calling about. I spotted your furry friend on the steps of the laundromat yesterday when I was picking up coffee. Magnificent creature, sitting there perfectly still when the recycling truck stopped and the church bell rang noon. Like he's got a clock in his chest." Marlowe hadn't realized Quill had returned to his old habit, despite now living at her apartment. She made a mental note to check if Mrs. Abernathy at the laundromat had been keeping an eye on him. "That's Quill," she confirmed. "He's a creature of habit. Precisely why I'm calling," Keen continued enthusiastically. "I'd like to feature him and Harbor Haven in a new segment I'm developing. Sounds of Millfield. 5 minutes of local sounds, stories, and spotlights. Your window-watching wonder would be perfect for our first feature." The offer was unexpected but intriguing. "What exactly would this involve?" "Nothing complicated," Keen assured her. "I'd stop by, record some ambient sounds, the shelter, the street, maybe that magnificent purr of his if he's amenable, and chat with you about Harbor Haven's situation, get the word out about your closing, the need for adoptions and support. What do you say?" It was another small thread in the tapestry of community connections that seemed to be weaving itself around Harbor Haven. "I say yes," Marlowe replied. "When would you like to come by? How about tomorrow afternoon?" "I could swing by around 3 after my show wraps." Tomorrow was shaping up to be busy. School reading program in the morning, Keen's recording in the afternoon, Hollis working on the boiler in the evening. It was more activity than Harbour Haven had seen in months, and Marlowe found the prospect both energizing and slightly overwhelming. "Tomorrow at 3 works," she confirmed. "I'll make sure Quill is here." The following day unfolded like a well-choreographed dance, each appointment flowing into the next, with barely a moment for Marlowe to catch her breath. The morning reading session at the school had been even more successful than the first, with Calla managing to read an entire story with only minimal stuttering. Several other students had been introduced to Quill as well, each responding to his calm presence in their own way. When Keen arrived at Harbour Haven precisely at 3, he brought with him an impressive array of recording equipment and an enthusiasm that filled the quiet shelter. "Perfect, perfect," he murmured, setting up a microphone near the window where Quill typically sat. "The acoustics in here are surprisingly good. All these hard surfaces creating natural reverb." Marlowe watched somewhat bemusedly as Keen worked, positioning Quill, who tolerated the attention with his usual dignity, and recording various sounds: the creak of the shelter door, the distant church bell, the hum of the laundromat next door, and finally, after much patient waiting, Quill's deep, rhythmic purr. "That's gold," Keen whispered reverently as he captured the sound. "Absolute audio gold." The interview portion was brief but thorough, with Keen asking insightful questions about Harbour Haven's history, its current challenges, and its hopes for the future. Marlowe found herself speaking more passionately than she had in months. The recent connections with the church, the school, and now the radio station rekindling her belief that the shelter might yet survive in some form. "One last question," Keen said, as he began packing up his equipment. "If our listeners want to help, what's the most urgent need right now?" Marlowe didn't hesitate. "Consistent support. Not just one-time donations, but regular giving that we can count on for planning, and volunteers who show up when they say they will." Keen nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Commitment, reliability, the same qualities your famous feline displays." He glanced at Quill, who had returned to his window post. "I think our listeners will respond to that. The segment will air tomorrow morning at 8:15. I'll send you the link for your social media." After Keen left, Marlowe barely had time to feed Quill and tidy the office before Hollis arrived, his truck loaded with salvaged boiler parts and tools. He worked efficiently but unhurriedly, his deep voice occasionally rising in snatches of song as he communed with the old boiler. By the time evening fell, a miraculous transformation had occurred. Warmth was spreading through the shelter for the first time in weeks. The ancient boiler, while still far from perfect, was once again fulfilling its purpose with a steady determination that reminded Marlowe of Quill himself. "She'll need regular attention," Hollis warned as he packed up his tools. "Weekly checks at minimum, and this is still a temporary fix. Come spring, you'll need to think about a proper replacement." "If we're still here in spring," Marlowe reminded him, though the words held less finality than they might have a week ago. Hollis studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Seems to me like Millfield's decided you will be," he finally said, "one way or another." That night, as Marlowe worked late updating donor records and volunteer schedules, she found herself surrounded by an unfamiliar sensation. Hope, as palpable as the warmth now emanating from the revived boiler. Quill dozed nearby on a blanket, his breathing deep and even, untroubled by the precariousness of their situation. Outside, the evening streets of Millfield settled into their usual quiet rhythm. The laundromat hummed, the church lights dimmed after choir practice, and somewhere in the WMIL studio, Keen Dillard was editing together the sounds of their small corner of the world into something that might, just possibly, help keep Harbour Haven's lights on a little longer. The next morning, Millfield awoke to the familiar voice of Keen Dillard streaming from car radios, kitchen countertop speakers, and the small transistor radios that many of the town's older residents still preferred to digital alternatives. "Good morning, Millfield. It's a beautiful Thursday in our little corner of the world, and I've got something special for you today. The debut of our new segment, Sounds of Millfield, where we listen to the heartbeat of our community one story at a time." In her apartment, Marlowe paused in the middle of pouring coffee, her attention captured by Keen's voice emanating from her small kitchen radio. Beside her, Quill sat on the counter, a liberty she pretended not to notice, his ears pricked forward with interest. "Today, we're starting with a story that's been quietly unfolding on Harper Street for 15 years. It's about second chances, steady presence, and how sometimes the smallest creatures teach us the biggest lessons. What followed was a masterfully crafted audio tapestry, the creak of Harbour Haven's front door opening, the distant toll of the church bell, the hum of laundromat dryers, and beneath it all the steady rhythmic purr of Quill. Keen's narration wove between these sounds, telling the story of Harbour Haven's struggle and Quill's unexpected role as its ambassador. Every day at noon, when St. Michael's bell tolls 12 times and the recycling truck makes its rounds, one resident of Harbour Haven keeps perfect time. Quill, the tabby timekeeper, sits at his post by the window or on the laundromat steps, a steady presence in an unsteady world. Marlowe's own voice entered the narrative, speaking about the shelter's mission and its uncertain future. She was surprised by how confident she sounded, how the passion she thought had been buried under months of struggle still resonated in her words. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. We're more than a building, her recorded voice explained. We're a promise to animals who have nowhere else to go. That promise doesn't end because our lease does. As the segment concluded, Keen returned with a direct appeal to his listeners. Harbour Haven needs our help, Millfield. Not just one-time gestures, but consistent support, regular donations, reliable volunteers, and perhaps most importantly, homes for animals who deserve a second chance. If you've ever considered adding a pet to your family, now is the time. And if you can't adopt, consider fostering, volunteering, or becoming a monthly donor, because communities take care of their own, whether they have 2 legs or 4. The segment ended with the sound that had begun it, Quill's purr, steady and reassuring, fading gently into the morning news. Marlowe stood motionless in her kitchen, coffee forgotten, unexpectedly moved by Keen's portrayal of their situation. It wasn't just the facts he'd presented, but the way he'd captured the essence of what made Harbour Haven special, the commitment to keeping promises, the belief that every creature deserved care and respect. Her phone chimed with a text from Ria Yarrow. Listening to WMIL, brilliant segment. The school board meets this afternoon. I'm proposing an official partnership with Harbour Haven for our reading program. We'll keep you posted. Before Marlowe could respond, another text arrived, this one from Reverend Greer. Wonderful radio piece. 3 new volunteers have already called the church office asking how to help at Sunday's adoption event. The Lord works in mysterious ways, sometimes through cat purrs on the radio. Throughout the day, similar messages arrived from various community members who had heard the segment. Mrs. Abernathy from the laundromat called to propose tokens for tomorrow, a program where Tuesday customers could donate a portion of their laundry tokens to Harbour Haven, provided Quill made his regular appearance on the steps. By mid-afternoon, the shelter's donation page had recorded more activity than in the previous 3 months combined. Most contributions were modest, but many came with notes promising monthly recurrence, exactly the kind of sustainable support Marlowe had identified as most crucial. When Marlowe arrived at Harbour Haven that evening to continue sorting through files and preparing for Sunday's adoption event, she found Hollis Pike's truck already parked outside. He was kneeling by the boiler, making some final adjustments, his baritone voice echoing through the quiet building as he sang what sounded like a hymn. He paused when he heard her enter, glancing up with a slight smile. "Hope you don't mind. I had a gap between jobs and thought I'd check on our patient. She's doing well but needed a bit of fine-tuning." "I don't mind at all," Marlowe assured him, setting down her bags. "Actually, I'm grateful. It's been a surprisingly busy day. Heard the radio piece this morning?" Hollis nodded. Keen's got away with words and sounds, caught the essence of this place. He patted the boiler gently. "Speaking of which, she's purring almost as nicely as your famous feline now." As if summoned by the mention, Quill emerged from his carrier, which Marlowe had set down near the door. He surveyed the room with his characteristic attention before approaching the boiler room with cautious interest. To Marlowe's surprise, Quill walked directly to where Hollis was kneeling and settled himself nearby, watching the man's work with the same focused gaze he typically reserved for the street outside. "Well, hello there," Hollis greeted him, his deep voice softening. "Come to supervise, have you?" Marlowe watched in amazement as Quill stretched out beside the now warming boiler, his body relaxing in a way she rarely saw outside of his window perch. The rumble of his purr joined the gentler hum of the repaired heating system, creating a harmonious duet in the small space. "He approves of your work," Marlowe observed with a smile. High praise indeed from such a discerning inspector, Hollis replied, his weathered face crinkling with pleasure. He returned to his adjustments, occasionally explaining what he was doing in low tones, as if Quill were an apprentice learning the trade. When Hollis finally packed up his tools an hour later, Quill remained by the boiler, basking in the steady warmth that now filled the building. He's welcome to stay here tonight if he likes, Hollis suggested, nodding toward the contented cat. Place is warm enough now, and he seems settled. Might do him good to spend some time in familiar territory. Marlowe hesitated, having grown accustomed to Quill's presence in her apartment. I don't know. Just a thought, Hollis said easily. But sometimes creatures of habit need their routines. Helps them make sense of change when it comes. He shouldered his toolbox. I'll see you Sunday for the adoption event. Bringing my daughter and her husband. They've been thinking about getting a cat. After Hollis left, Marlowe sat on the floor near Quill, listening to the now healthy sounds of the boiler and watching as he dozed in the warmth. The shelter felt different somehow, not just physically warmer, but filled with a renewed sense of purpose that had been missing for months. What do you think? She asked Quill softly. Stay here tonight? Reclaim your territory? Quill opened one eye lazily, regarding her with what she chose to interpret as consideration rather than indifference. After a moment, he stretched, rose, and walked deliberately to his old window perch, jumping up and settling into the familiar hollow worn by years of his watchful presence. Decision made, then. Marlowe spent another hour setting out fresh water and food, arranging a comfortable sleeping spot near the boiler, and making sure all doors and windows were secure. Before leaving, she stood in the doorway, watching as Quill surveyed his domain from his perch, looking for all the world like a monarch returned from exile. I'll be back first thing tomorrow, she promised him. Sleep well. As she drove home to an apartment that would feel strangely empty without Quill's presence, Marlowe reflected on how quickly things had changed. A week ago, Harbor Haven had been dying a slow, lonely death, abandoned by the community it had served for 15 years. Now, thread by thread, connection by connection, a support network was forming, tentative still, but growing stronger with each passing day. It wasn't a miracle, not yet. The lease still terminated at the end of the month. The building code violations still needed addressing. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in months, Marlowe allowed herself to believe that Harbor Haven's story might not be ending after all. It might just be entering a new chapter, and at the heart of this unexpected turn of events was a simple tabby cat who had captured the imagination of an entire town simply by being himself, watchful, patient, present. A creature who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you could offer was not grand gestures, but steady, reliable presence. As Millfield settled into its evening rhythm, Quill kept his vigil by the window of Harbor Haven, a silent guardian watching over a building that had sheltered him when no one else would, and that he, in turn, was helping to save, one purr at a time. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, with the kind of crisp autumn air that carried the scent of wood smoke and the promise of frost. Marlowe arrived at Harbor Haven early, arms full of adoption applications and informational packets for the church event. She found Quill exactly where she'd left him 2 nights before, sitting regally on his window perch as if he'd never been away. "Good morning, Your Majesty," she greeted him, setting down her materials to refresh his food and water. "Ready for your public appearance?" The adoption event at First Baptist had been advertised on WMIL, in the school newsletter, and on posters throughout downtown Millfield. Reverend Greer had assured Marlowe that interest was high, with several families already expressing intent to attend specifically to meet Quill and learn more about Harbor Haven's needs. As Marlowe prepared for the day, checking and double-checking her supplies, the shelter phone rang. It was Eliza Whitfield, her precise voice carrying clearly through the receiver. "Marlowe, dear, I'm calling about today's event. There's been a development you should be aware of." Something in the elderly woman's tone made Marlowe's stomach tighten. "What kind of development?" Margaret Dawson had an allergic reaction at Wednesday's knitting circle. "Quite severe, I'm afraid." "She's fine now," Eliza hastened to add, but the doctor confirmed it was a cat allergy. She was sitting right where Quill had been during Sunday coffee. Marlowe closed her eyes briefly, anticipating what was coming. "And the church is concerned about liability. The church council discussed it last night," Eliza confirmed. "They're not cancelling the event, but they are requiring certain accommodations. Reverend Greer asked me to call as I've become your unofficial liaison." By the time the call ended, Marlowe had a list of new requirements. air purifiers for any room where animals would be present, clear demarcation of animal and non-animal areas, proper cleaning protocols documented and posted, and liability waivers for all attendees. These were reasonable precautions, Marlowe knew, but they represented an additional expense that Harbour Haven could ill afford. The adoption event budget, already stretched thin, would now need to cover equipment rentals and additional supplies. One step forward, two steps back, she muttered to Quill, who watched her with his usual attentive gaze. Story of our lives lately. Still, the event couldn't be cancelled, not when so much community interest had been generated. Somehow, they would make it work. A knock at the shelter door interrupted her worried calculations. Through the glass she could see Hollis Pike, accompanied by a younger couple, presumably his daughter and son-in-law. "Morning," Hollis greeted as she opened the door. "Hope we're not too early. Jenna and Mike here are eager to meet the famous Quill before the crowds descend." Jenna Pike, now Jenna Brennan according to the adoption pre-application she'd completed, was a younger version of her father, tall and solid, with the same direct gaze. Her husband Mike was slighter, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "We heard the radio segment," Jenna explained as they entered. "Dad's been talking about this place for days, and when he mentioned you had other cats besides the famous one, we thought maybe—" "They've been on the fence about adopting for months," Hollis interjected. "This one worries about the responsibility," he nodded toward his son-in-law, "and this one works long hours at the hospital." He tilted his head toward his daughter. "Dad," Jenna sighed with the long-suffering patience of an adult child. "We can explain ourselves." Mike laughed softly. "What he means is that we've been waiting for the right time and the right cat. When we heard about Harbour Haven's situation, it seemed like maybe this was both." Marlowe led them to the small room where the shelter's remaining cats were housed temporarily. Besides Quill, Harbour Haven had 4 other felines still awaiting homes. An elderly bonded pair named Salt and Pepper, a one-eyed former stray called Winky, and a shy tortoiseshell who had been named Maple for her autumn-colored coat. As the Brennans met each cat, Marlowe updated them on the morning's development with the church requirements. Hollis listened thoughtfully, running his hand over his silver-streaked hair. "Air purifiers, you say? What kind are they asking for?" "HEPA filters, preferably, and room dividers to create separate zones." Marlowe sighed. "All perfectly reasonable, but it's going to eat through our event budget and then some." Hollis nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The hardware store on Main Street might have what you need. Osric Thatch is a prickly sort, but his prices are fair." At the mention of Thatch, Marlowe's expression clouded. "We've had some issues with Mr. Thatch. He filed a complaint with the town council last month about our weekend adoption events creating neighborhood disruption." "Did he now?" Hollis's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well, that complicates things. Still, might be worth a try. Sometimes a direct approach works best with difficult folks." While they talked, Jenna and Mike had settled on the floor near the cat enclosures. To everyone's surprise, the shy tortoiseshell Maple had emerged from her hiding spot and was cautiously approaching Mike's outstretched hand. "Well, look at that," Hollis observed softly. "Seems like someone's made a decision for you." The quiet moment was interrupted by Marlowe's phone ringing again. This time it was Keen Dillard, his usually jovial voice tight with urgency. "Marlowe, we might have a situation brewing. Osric Thatch just called the station, asking for airtime to discuss community concerns about Harbour Haven activities. I stalled him, but he's determined. Thought you should know before he blindsides you." After ending the call, Marlowe explained the development to Hollis, her frustration evident. Perfect timing. "Now we need supplies from a man who's actively working against us." Hollis considered this for a moment. "Tell you what, you focus on getting the church set up ready. I'll pay Mr. Thatch a visit, see if we can't find some common ground." "I couldn't ask you to—" "You didn't ask," Hollis interrupted gently. "I offered. Besides, Osric and I go way back. Installed all the plumbing in that store of his when he took it over from his father. He might be prickly, but he's not unreasonable." While Jenna and Mike completed adoption paperwork for Maple, who had decisively chosen them by settling in Mike's lap, Hollis made a few phone calls. By the time they left for the church, he had arranged for borrowed air purifiers from the hospital where Jenna worked, room dividers from the school, courtesy of a quick call to Ria Yarrow, and cleaning supplies donated by several choir members. "Sometimes it just takes asking the right people," he explained with a modest shrug, when Marlowe expressed her amazement at his efficiency. "Small towns are good that way." The adoption event set up at First Baptist went more smoothly than Marlowe had dared hope. Volunteers arrived early, including several new faces who mentioned hearing Keen's radio segment. The fellowship hall was transformed into a welcoming space with clearly marked animal and allergy-free zones, information tables, and comfortable meeting areas where potential adopters could interact with the shelter's remaining residents. Quill, as the guest of honor, had a special area near the windows where the morning light created a warm patch on his borrowed blanket. He observed the proceedings with his characteristic dignified attention, neither seeking nor avoiding the admiration of visitors who came specifically to meet the cat from the radio. By mid-morning, the event was in full swing. Salt and Pepper, the elderly bonded pair, were meeting with a retired couple who had lost their own senior cat earlier that year. Winky, the one-eyed former stray, was charming a family whose young daughter kept exclaiming about his pirate patch. Even Osric Thatch had made an appearance, standing stiffly at the edge of the room with his arms crossed, observing but not participating. Marlowe was explaining Harbour Haven's volunteer needs to a group of interested community members when Hollis appeared at her side, his expression urgent but controlled. "We've got a situation," he murmured. Town inspector just arrived. Apparently, someone filed a complaint about code violations for today's event. Marlowe's heart sank. "Thatch?" Hollis nodded grimly. "Looks that way. Inspector's talking to Reverend Greer now. They're asking for permits we don't have, special event licenses, health department clearances for animals in a food service area." "But we're not serving food in the animal areas," Marlowe protested. "We followed all the guidelines about separation and air quality." "I know that and you know that," Hollis agreed. "But bureaucracy has its own logic. The inspector's just doing his job." Across the room, Marlowe could see Reverend Greer in conversation with a woman in a town employee jacket, his normally serene expression strained. Nearby, Osric Thatch watched with what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. "This could shut us down," Marlowe realized aloud. "Not just today's event, but any future church partnerships. We can't afford more violations on our record." Hollis squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "Let me talk to Osric. There has to be a reason behind all this opposition." While Hollis approached the hardware store owner, Marlowe made her way to where Reverend Greer was speaking with the inspector. As she drew closer, she could hear the woman explaining the complaint in detail, specifically about noise levels, parking congestion, and unauthorized animal events in a zone not cleared for such activities. As the property owner, the church could face fines if these issues aren't addressed. "Barbara," Marlowe interrupted, recognizing the inspector as Barbara Chen, mother of the school librarian. "I had no idea there were concerns about our events. We've always tried to be respectful of neighborhood regulations." Barbara's expression softened slightly at the sight of Marlowe. "It's not personal, Marlowe. A formal complaint was filed, and I have to follow up. The paperwork for these events should have been submitted 30 days in advance." "Could we apply retroactively?" Reverend Greer suggested. "The shelter is in a difficult transition period, and these events are crucial for finding homes for the remaining animals." Barbara hesitated, glancing at her clipboard. "There might be a provision for emergency circumstances, but—" "Excuse me?" All three turned to find Osric Thatch standing behind them, his thin face flushed with what might have been embarrassment or annoyance. Beside him, Hollis Pike towered like a protective shadow. "Mr. Thatch," Barbara acknowledged, "since you filed the complaint, perhaps you'd like to clarify your concerns directly." Osric cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable under the combined gaze of the group. "It has come to my attention that I may have misunderstood certain aspects of these events. My primary concern was unregulated activity affecting the neighborhood's character, but Mr. Pike has explained the situation more thoroughly." Hollis nodded encouragingly, and Osric continued with visible effort. "In light of new information, I'd like to withdraw my complaint. Furthermore," he added, the words seeming to cost him considerable pride, "I'm willing to cover the neighborhood usage fee for today's event as a gesture of community support." The unexpected reversal left everyone momentarily speechless. Barbara recovered first, making notes on her clipboard with evident relief. "That simplifies matters considerably. I'll still need some basic paperwork for my files, but with the complaint withdrawn and the usage fee covered, we can classify this as a community benefit event with special dispensation." As Barbara moved away to complete her forms, Reverend Greer excused himself to announce that the event would continue as planned, leaving Marlowe facing Osric and Hollis. "That was unexpected," she managed finally. "Thank you, Mr. Thatch." Osric nodded stiffly, his discomfort obvious. Mr. Pike made some persuasive arguments about neighborhood character, being defined by how we treat our most vulnerable residents, including the four-legged ones. He straightened his already impeccable collar. I still expect proper permits for future events and advance notice of any activities that might affect street parking. But I recognize that Harbor Haven has been a stable presence on Harper Street for many years. With that grudging acknowledgement, he nodded once more and walked away, his posture rigid, but perhaps carrying slightly less tension than before. Marlowe turned to Hollis with undisguised amazement. "What on earth did you say to him?" Hollis's weathered face creased in a small smile. "Just reminded him that a neighborhood is more than buildings and ordinances. It's about the people and animals who make it a community. That, and I might have mentioned that his hardware store would get good publicity as a shelter supporter rather than opponent." "Practical and principled," Marlowe observed. "A powerful combination." "Speaking of practical," Hollis said, his expression growing more serious, "we should talk about next steps. These events and community connections are buying time, but you still need a long-term solution for Harbor Haven." Before Marlowe could respond, a commotion near Quill's area drew their attention. A small crowd had gathered, their faces showing a mixture of concern and amusement. At the center was Calla Wynne, the young reader from the school program, who appeared to be reading aloud from a book while seated cross-legged beside Quill's blanket. As Marlowe approached, she realized that this impromptu reading session had attracted not only onlookers but potential adopters who had paused their conversations to listen. Calla's voice, which had stumbled so terribly during their first meeting, now flowed with only occasional hesitations as she read a story about a cat who thought he was a tiger. Quill, for his part, was the picture of attentive dignity, his eyes half closed in what appeared to be contentment as the child's voice washed over him. Every few pages, Calla would turn the book so he could see the illustrations, a gesture of such natural consideration that it brought an unexpected lump to Marlowe's throat. Rhea Yarrow materialized at Marlowe's side, her expression pleased but not surprised. She asked if she could read to him when she arrived with her parents, said he helps her find her words. "I had no idea she'd be here today," Marlowe admitted. "Her mother saw the flyer at the school," Rhea explained. "Calla insisted on coming. She's been practicing that book all week, wanting to show Quill how much she's improved." As they watched, Calla turned the final page and closed the book with evident satisfaction. The small crowd applauded softly, causing her to look up in surprise, a shy smile spreading across her face as she realized she had been performing for more than just Quill. The rest of the adoption event unfolded with unexpected smoothness. By early afternoon, all of Harbor Haven's remaining cats except Quill had adoption applications pending, including Salt and Pepper, who would be going home with the retired couple who had bonded with them immediately. As volunteers began the cleanup process, Marlowe found herself surrounded by a small group of community members who had lingered. Reverend Greer, Rhea Yarrow, Keen Dillard, who had broadcast part of his morning show live from the event, Hollis Pike, and even Eliza Whitfield, who had appointed herself treasurer of the day's donations. "Quite successful, all things considered," Eliza declared, counting the contents of the donation jar with methodical precision. "Enough here to cover next month's basic expenses, assuming you find a new location with reasonable rent." "That's the catch," Marlowe sighed. "Commercial space in Millfield is limited, and anything affordable would need significant renovation to meet shelter requirements." "What about the old Millfield Mercantile building?" Keene suggested. "It's been vacant since they moved to the new location on Route 9. Reverend Greer shook his head. "Zoning issues. The town council won't approve animal housing in that district. The school has that unused maintenance building behind the playing fields," Rhea offered. "But it would need extensive work to make it suitable." As the conversation continued, each suggestion meeting a practical obstacle, Marlowe felt the brief euphoria of the day's success giving way to the persistent reality of Harbor Haven's situation. They had gained support, yes, but still lacked a viable path forward. Hollis, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "What about focusing on what you do have rather than what you don't?" The group turned to him with various expressions of confusion. "What I mean is," he continued, "Harbor Haven has built solid community partnerships over the past few weeks. The church, the school, the radio station. Maybe the solution isn't finding one perfect building, but distributing your services across these existing relationships." Marlowe considered this, intrigued but uncertain. "A decentralized shelter, more like a community-integrated one," Hollis clarified. "The reading program continues at the school. Adoption events happen here at the church. Maybe foster networks instead of a central housing facility. Less overhead, more involvement. It's an interesting concept, Ria said thoughtfully, though there would still need to be some central coordination point. My office has that unused meeting room, Reverend Greer mused. It could serve as an administrative hub, at least temporarily. As they discussed the possibilities and challenges of this unconventional approach, Marlowe found her gaze drawn to where Quill sat, watching them from his blanket, those attentive eyes taking in the conversation as if he understood every word. In many ways, he had already pioneered this community-integrated model, spending time at the school, the church, the laundromat, each place benefiting from his steady presence. It could work, she said finally. Not forever, perhaps, but as a transition strategy while we explore more permanent options. And it would keep Harbor Haven's mission alive, even without a dedicated building. The conversation continued, growing more detailed and practical as each person contributed ideas from their area of expertise. Eliza insisted on proper financial tracking and regular reports. Keane offered ongoing media support to keep the community informed. Ria outlined potential educational programs that could be integrated with the school curriculum. By the time the church fellowship hall had been restored to its original condition, a tentative plan had emerged, one that would allow Harbor Haven to continue its essential services even as it evolved into something new and more deeply embedded in the community it served. As Marlowe prepared to leave with Quill, who had observed the entire proceedings with his characteristic calm attention, Reverend Greer approached her one last time. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "there's a saying that the church isn't the building, but the people. Perhaps the same is true for Harbor Haven. It's not the structure on Harper Street, but the commitment to care that defines it." Marlowe glanced down at Quill in his carrier, his watchful eyes meeting hers with what she chose to interpret as agreement. "I think you're right," she replied. "Though I admit I never expected to be reimagining our entire operation with less than 2 weeks left on our lease. The most important transformations rarely come when or how we expect them," Reverend Greer said with a gentle smile, "but they often arrive exactly when needed." As Marlowe drove back to Harbor Haven to collect some essential files and supplies, she found herself contemplating the strange journey of the past weeks. What had begun as a reluctant countdown to closure had somehow transformed into an unexpected rebirth, one catalyzed not by a single dramatic intervention, but by a series of small connections, each strengthening the next until a new pattern emerged. And at the center of this transformation was Quill, the cat who had been overlooked for so long, whose quiet dignity and steady presence had somehow captured the imagination and support of an entire community. Not through dramatic displays or unusual talents, but simply by being himself, watchful, patient, present. Sometimes Marlowe reflected as she parked outside the shelter that might soon no longer be Harbor Haven's home. The most powerful force for change wasn't dramatic action, but consistent presence. A lesson Quill had been teaching all along, if only she had been watching as carefully as he did. The following Tuesday arrived with the first truly bitter cold of the season. Overnight, temperatures had plunged below freezing, and Millfield awoke to find delicate frost patterns etched on windows and windshields. The sudden cold snap had caught many by surprise, including Harbor Haven's ancient boiler, which groaned and sputtered before falling ominously silent just after dawn. Marlowe discovered the problem when she arrived at the shelter to prepare for Quill's scheduled appearance at the school reading program. The building was already alarmingly cold, her breath visible in the office as she frantically called Hollis Pike's emergency number. "It's completely dead," she reported when he answered. "No heat at all, and the temperature's dropping by the minute." "On my way," Hollis promised. "But Marlowe, you should know, parts for that model are special order. Even if I can diagnose the problem today, repairs could take a week or more." After ending the call, Marlowe stood in the increasingly frigid office, weighing her options. The adoption event had been successful, with only Quill remaining at Harbor Haven. The shelter's administrative functions could temporarily relocate to the church meeting room, as discussed on Sunday. But the timing couldn't have been worse. Today was supposed to be Quill's reading session with Calla and the other students, an obligation Marlowe was reluctant to cancel. Her phone chimed with a text from Ria Yarrow. "Bus just picked up Calla. She's been talking about reading to Quill all morning. See you at 10. Decision made, Marlowe quickly gathered essential files, Quill's supplies, and her laptop. By the time Hollis arrived 20 minutes later, she had loaded everything into her car and was coaxing Quill into his carrier. "I'm taking him to the school program as planned," she explained, as Hollis examined the silent boiler. "After that, we'll set up temporarily at the church until we figure this out." Hollis nodded, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Good call. This old girl might be fixable, but not quickly." He hesitated, then added, "You know, this might be the push you needed to implement that community-integrated model we discussed." "Not exactly how I planned to start the transition," Marlowe admitted, "but you're right. No sense fighting it." The school library was wonderfully warm after the chill of Harbor Haven, its shelves creating cozy nooks that trapped and held the heat. Mrs. Chen had prepared the reading corner with extra cushions and a small carpet square specifically for Quill, who emerged from his carrier with uncharacteristic eagerness, perhaps appreciating the warmth as much as Marlowe did. Calla was already waiting, a new book clutched in her hands, her dark braids tied with ribbons that suggested this was a special occasion in her eyes. When she spotted Quill, her face lit up with a smile that transformed her usually serious expression. "Fiuka came," she exclaimed, the slight stutter a remnant of her former struggle. "We wouldn't miss it," Marlowe assured her, touched by the child's evident delight. "Quill has been looking forward to hearing your new book." As Calla settled cross-legged on the cushions, and Quill arranged himself on the carpet square beside her, Rhea Yarrow drew Marlowe aside with a concerned expression. "Everything all right? You seemed a bit frazzled when you arrived." Marlowe explained the boiler situation and the accelerated implementation of their transition plan. To her surprise, Rhea's response was immediate and practical. "Use my office this afternoon. It's warm, private, and I have meetings outside the building until 4. You can make calls, organize files, whatever you need to do while Quill is here for the reading program." The offer was so unexpectedly perfect that Marlowe felt a sudden, embarrassing prickle of tears. "That would be incredibly helpful, Rhea. Thank you." "Community integration works both ways," the principal reminded her with a gentle smile. "Now, I believe we have some young readers waiting for their special guest." The reading session was even more successful than previous ones. Calla, emboldened by her experience at the church event, read with growing confidence, pausing only occasionally when confronted with particularly challenging words. 2 other students took turns as well, each responding differently to Quill's attentive presence, one growing calmer, the other more animated, but both clearly benefiting from the interaction. While the children read, Marlowe observed from a distance, noting how Quill seemed to adjust his behavior to each child's needs, remaining perfectly still for the anxious reader, offering an occasional slow blink to the one who sought more engagement. It was subtle but unmistakable, this ability to provide exactly the kind of presence each child required. During a break between reading sessions, Mrs. Chen approached Marlowe with an unexpected question. "Have you considered training Quill as a certified therapy animal? His temperament is ideal, and it would open up more formal opportunities for programs like this." The suggestion was intriguing. "I don't know much about the certification process," Marlowe admitted. "My sister works with a therapy animal organization in Springfield," Mrs. Chen offered. "I'd be happy to connect you. The training isn't extensive for an animal with Quill's natural disposition, and the certification would allow him to visit hospitals, nursing homes, other schools. It was yet another thread in the emerging tapestry of Harbor Haven's future, one that might create sustainable funding through service contracts rather than relying solely on donations. Marlowe added it to her mental list of possibilities to explore. After the reading program concluded, Marlowe accepted Rhea's offer of office space, setting up a temporary command center from which to coordinate Harbor Haven's accelerated transition. Quill, perhaps sensing the importance of the moment, settled on a patch of sunlight near the window, his watchful gaze alternating between Marlowe's activities and the schoolyard beyond. Throughout the afternoon, Marlowe made calls, updated spreadsheets, and drafted emails to volunteers and supporters, explaining the situation. Reverend Greer confirmed that the church meeting room was available immediately. Keen Dillard offered to announce the temporary relocation on tomorrow's show. Eliza Whitfield, appointed treasurer of Harbor Haven's emergency fund, provided a detailed accounting of available resources and suggested budget reallocations. By 4 o'clock, when Rhea returned from her off-site meetings, Marlowe had established the basic framework for Harbor Haven's community-integrated phase, what she was now calling Harbor Haven 2.0 in her notes. "Productive afternoon?" Rhea inquired, noting the organized stacks of papers and Marlowe's less frantic demeanor. "Very," Marlowe confirmed, "though we're still facing significant challenges. The property owner expects the building to be completely vacated by the end of the month, which gives us less than 2 weeks to remove everything from the shelter. The school's maintenance shed has some storage space, Rhea offered. Not climate-controlled, but secure for equipment and supplies that aren't sensitive to temperature. It was yet another small kindness in a growing chain of community support, each link making the seemingly impossible task a little more manageable. As Marlowe packed up her makeshift office and prepared to transport Quill to their next temporary home at the church, her phone rang. It was Hollis, his deep voice tinged with concern. "The news isn't good," he reported without preamble. "The boiler's main heat exchanger has cracked, likely from age and the sudden temperature drop. Replacement would cost more than a new unit, and given the building's uncertain future, not worth the investment," Marlowe finished for him. "I understand. There's more," Hollis continued. "The pipes are at risk of freezing if the building remains unheated in this weather. Could cause significant damage to the property." This was a complication Marlowe hadn't anticipated. Harbor Haven was responsible for maintaining the building until the lease officially ended, including preventing any damage that might occur during the vacancy. If pipes froze and burst, the resulting water damage could cost thousands that the shelter simply didn't have. "What are our options?" she asked, already dreading the answer. "Short-term, space heaters positioned strategically near plumbing. Long-term, professional winterization of the system, which isn't cheap." Hollis paused. "I can help with the immediate need. Got some industrial heaters we use on construction sites, but they'll need monitoring. Someone would have to check on them regularly." By the time Marlowe arrived at First Baptist Church with Quill and her essential files, a new crisis management plan was taking shape. Hollis would provide and position emergency heaters at Harbor Haven. Volunteers would establish a rotation to check them every few hours. Meanwhile, the shelter's remaining equipment, supplies, and furnishings would need to be removed and either stored or distributed to temporary locations even more quickly than originally planned. Reverend Greer met them at the church office, keys in hand to the promised meeting room. "Your new temporary headquarters," he announced, opening the door to a modest but well-lit space with a desk, filing cabinet, and small table. "Phone lines active, Wi-Fi password is on the desk, and I've put fresh coffee in the pot next door." The thoughtfulness of these preparations, coming at the end of such a challenging day, nearly undid Marlowe's carefully maintained composure. "Thomas, I can't thank you enough for this." "No thanks needed," he assured her. "This is what community means, being there when the need arises." As Marlowe set up her laptop and arranged Quill's carrier in a comfortable corner, Reverend Greer watched with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he observed, "when you first brought Quill to our Sunday coffee, I thought we were helping him, and Harbor Haven, but I'm beginning to think he's the one helping us." Marlowe glanced at Quill, who was cautiously exploring his new surroundings, his tail held high as he assessed each corner of the room. "How do you mean?" "He's created connections that weren't there before," Reverend Greer explained, "between the church and the school, between Mrs. Abernathy at the laundromat and Eliza's knitting circle, between Hollis and Osric Thatch, which I would have thought impossible a month ago." He smiled gently. In his quiet way, he's reminded us how to be neighbors again. The observation struck Marlowe as profoundly true. What had begun as a desperate attempt to find Quill a temporary home had somehow evolved into a community-wide reevaluation of what home and belonging truly meant. As night fell over Millfield, bringing with it temperatures forecasted to drop into the low 20s, Marlowe found herself in the strangest situation she could have imagined just weeks ago, sitting at a borrowed desk in a church meeting room, coordinating an emergency volunteer schedule via text message, while Quill dozed contentedly on a blanket that Eliza Whitfield had dropped off because church heating can be unpredictable and he deserves the best. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, as Marlowe finally closed her laptop and prepared the small cot Reverend Greer had insisted on setting up for her, just in case, she found herself experiencing an unexpected emotion amid the chaos. Gratitude. Not because the situation was ideal, it was far from it, but because when Harbor Haven had needed help most, the community had responded not with distant sympathy, but with practical action. Borrowed heaters, volunteer schedules, storage spaces, temporary headquarters, budget assistance, media support, a tapestry of contributions woven together to create a safety net for both the shelter and its last resident. As Marlowe settled onto the cot, too exhausted to make the drive home, Quill abandoned his fancy blanket and jumped up beside her, curling into the curve of her body with uncharacteristic affection. His purr, deep and steady, vibrated against her side as she drifted towards sleep. Outside, the coldest night of the season tightened its grip on Millfield. At Harbour Haven, space heaters hummed in empty rooms, their orange coils casting long shadows on walls soon to be bare. But across town, in a borrowed church office, Harbour Haven's heart continued to beat, smaller perhaps, differently housed, but very much alive. The final days of Harbour Haven's lease passed in a whirlwind of activity. What had begun as a crisis, the boiler's failure on that bitter Tuesday, had accelerated their transition plan in unexpected ways, creating both challenges and opportunities. Volunteers materialized as if summoned by some unspoken community alarm. Hollis Pike brought his work crew on their lunch break to dismantle and transport the larger shelter equipment. Ria Yarrow organized a weekend storage squad of teachers and parents who efficiently categorized and distributed Harbour Haven supplies among various temporary locations. Keen Dillard not only announced these efforts on his morning show, but arrived with coffee and donuts for the workers, recording brief interviews that kept the community informed and engaged. Through it all, Quill maintained his routines with impressive adaptability. Each morning, he would accompany Marlowe to the church office that now served as Harbour Haven's headquarters. Tuesdays and Thursdays found him at the school reading program, his calm presence now an established part of the library's resources. Sundays were church coffee hours, where he held court from a special chair that Eliza Whitfield had designated exclusively for his use, much to the amusement of Reverend Greer. But most remarkably, every day at noon, regardless of where he happened to be, Quill would find a window or door and sit in watchful attention as the church bell tolled 12 times and the recycling truck made its rounds. It was as if he carried his own internal map of Millfield, always orienting himself toward Harper Street, even when physically elsewhere. Mrs. Abernathy from the laundromat had been particularly concerned about Quill's Tuesday ritual on her steps, worried that his displacement would end their newly established Tokens for Tomorrow program. To everyone's surprise, Quill seemed to understand the importance of this appointment, waiting patiently by the church door each Tuesday morning until someone, usually Reverend Greer, would walk him the 3 blocks to the laundromat, where he would assume his position with such perfect timing that customers began setting their watches by his arrival. It was on the final Tuesday of Harbour Haven's lease, exactly 1 month after Marlowe had first brought Quill home to her apartment, that the pieces of their new reality began to fall into a sustainable pattern. The day began with the now familiar routine: breakfast at the church office, a visit to the school for the reading program, followed by Quill's laundromat appearance. Marlowe had just returned to the church with Quill when Hollis arrived, his expression more serious than usual. "Final inspection at Harbour Haven is scheduled for tomorrow," he reminded her. "Property owner's representative will meet us at 9 to walk through and collect keys." Marlowe nodded, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest. Although Harbour Haven's operations had successfully transitioned to their distributed model, there was something final about surrendering the keys to the building that had housed their mission for 15 years. "I'll be there," she promised. "One last check tonight to make sure everything's clear." Hollis hesitated, then added, "Thought you might like some company for that. Last walkthroughs can be tough." The offer was so precisely what Marlowe needed that she couldn't immediately respond past the sudden lump in her throat. She simply nodded her acceptance. That afternoon brought another development when Ria Yarrow arrived at the church office with an official-looking folder tucked under her arm. "School board approval," she announced, placing the folder on Marlowe's desk. "Formal partnership agreement between Millfield Elementary and Harbour Haven, establishing the Reading Rescue Program as an ongoing enrichment activity." Marlowe opened the folder to find a detailed contract outlining the terms. Harbour Haven would provide animal visitors, primarily Quill, but potentially others in the future, for twice-weekly reading sessions. In exchange, the school would pay a program fee that, while modest, represented stable income that could be budgeted and relied upon. "This is wonderful, Ria," Marlowe said, scanning the document, "but I notice it's a 6-month agreement. What happens after that?" "Renewable by mutual consent," Ria explained with a knowing smile, "but between you and me, the board has already discussed including it in next year's budget as a permanent program. Calla's reading assessment scores have improved 12% since beginning sessions with Quill, and other participating students show similar gains." It was another piece of the emerging Harbour Haven 2.0, smaller in physical footprint, but more deeply integrated into the community fabric. Later that evening, as promised, Hollis met Marlowe at Harbour Haven for the final walkthrough. The building was eerily silent, its rooms empty of the equipment, supplies and animals that had given it purpose for so many years. Their footsteps echoed on the linoleum floors as they moved methodically from room to room, checking for anything overlooked in the moving process. In what had been the main cat room, Marlowe paused, her hand resting on the windowsill where Quill had spent countless hours watching Harper Street. The hollow worn in the sill by his persistent presence remained, a small physical testament to the power of steady attention. "Hard to believe it's really ending," she said quietly. Hollis nodded, his tall frame silhouetted against the doorway. "Endings and beginnings often look similar at first glance," he observed. "Both involve empty spaces waiting to be filled." They completed the inspection in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they reached the front entrance, Marlowe's hand hesitated on the light switch, the same one she had almost turned off that fateful evening a month ago, when Quill's single meow had seemed to say, "Not yet." "I remember standing here, ready to turn out the lights for what I thought was the last time," she told Hollis. "I was so sure it was over, that Harbour Haven had reached its end. And instead," Hollis prompted gently. "Instead, it transformed," Marlowe realized aloud. "Not ended, but evolved, became something different but still true to its purpose." Hollis smiled, the expression warming his weathered face. "Sounds like a beginning to me." This time, when Marlowe switched off the lights, there was no reluctance in the gesture, only a sense of completion. One chapter closing, another already underway. Outside, the autumn night was clear and cold, stars pricking the darkness above Millfield with unusual clarity. As they walked to their respective vehicles, Hollis cleared his throat in the way Marlowe had come to recognize as a prelude to something important. "Been meaning to ask you something," he began, his breath forming clouds in the chilly air. "That office at the church, it's working for now, but it's not a permanent solution." "I know," Marlowe agreed. "We're looking at affordable rental options, but commercial space in Millfield is limited." "What about residential space with a commercial allowance?" Hollis suggested. "My company just finished renovating the old Blackburn house on Maple Street. Ground floor has a separate entrance, good-sized rooms, proper heating system. Owners looking for a tenant interested in a long-term lease." Marlowe looked at him with surprise. "That sounds perfect, but Maple Street properties are well outside Harbour Haven's budget." "Owner might be flexible for the right tenant," Hollis said, his tone casual, but his eyes watching her reaction carefully, especially one providing a valuable community service. "And who is this remarkably community-minded property owner?" Marlowe asked, suspicion dawning. Hollis looked slightly embarrassed. "Well, that would be me. Bought it as an investment property last year. Renovation just finished last month." Marlowe stared at him, momentarily speechless. "Hollis, that's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly—" "It's not charity," he interrupted firmly. "It's a business arrangement that happens to benefit both parties. Property needs a responsible tenant. Harbour Haven needs a home base. Simple as that." There was more to it than that, Marlowe suspected, noting the careful way Hollis avoided meeting her eyes directly. But his offer, however motivated, represented exactly the kind of stable foundation Harbour Haven needed to fully implement its community-integrated model. "I'd need to see the space," she said finally, "and we'd have to discuss terms that are sustainable for Harbour Haven long-term." "Of course," Hollis agreed, visible relief crossing his features. "How about Thursday morning? I could show you the property. We could discuss details." They parted with plans to meet, Marlowe's mind already racing with possibilities. The Blackburn house was centrally located, within walking distance of both the school and the church. Its residential character would be perfect for Harbour Haven's evolving identity as a community resource, rather than a traditional shelter facility. When she arrived back at the church office, Marlowe found Quill sitting on his special blanket, watching the door as if expecting her return at precisely this moment. His steady gaze followed her as she moved around the small space, gathering her things and preparing to take him back to her apartment for the night. "Well, Mr. Quill," she said as she knelt beside him, "it seems we might have found a new home base. What do you think about Maple Street?" Quill blinked slowly, which Marlowe had come to interpret as approval. After a moment he stood, stretched, and walked deliberately to his carrier, pausing beside it with an expectant look that clearly communicated, "I'm ready when you are." The following days brought a flurry of activity as Marlowe, with Eliza Whitfield's financial scrutiny and Reverend Greer's practical advice, negotiated lease terms with Hollis for the Maple Street property. The resulting agreement was more favorable than Marlowe had dared hope. A below-market rent, with built-in stability clauses that protected both Harbour Haven and Hollis's investment. By Sunday, plans for Harbour Haven's next phase were solid enough to be presented to the community during the church coffee hour. Quill, seated regally on his designated chair, observed the proceedings with his characteristic attentive gaze as Marlowe outlined the new model to an interested audience of supporters. Harbour Haven will continue its mission, she explained, standing beside a simple poster that RIA's students had created, showing the various community connections now supporting the shelter. But instead of a single physical location housing animals, we'll operate as a hub, connecting foster homes, adoption events, educational programs, and therapy services. Questions followed, practical and encouraging. How would potential adopters meet animals? Through scheduled events at partner locations like the church and school. Where would donations be directed? Toward support for foster families, medical care for animals, and educational programs. Would Quill continue his community appearances? Absolutely, with an expanded schedule once his therapy animal certification was complete. As the presentation concluded, Eliza Whitfield stood, her white hair arranged in its immaculate bun, wire-rimmed glasses perched precisely on her nose. I believe I speak for many when I say this new direction seems not only practical, but enhanced, she declared in her no-nonsense tone. Harbour Haven is evolving with the times, as any good institution must. Her approval, delivered with characteristic directness, seemed to settle any lingering doubts among the assembled community members. Conversations shifted from questions about Harbour Haven's survival to suggestions for its growth, offers of foster homes, proposals for additional educational programs, ideas for fundraising events that could be hosted by various community groups. Later that afternoon, as Marlowe and Quill visited the Maple Street property to begin planning the layout of Harbour Haven's new headquarters, she reflected on the remarkable journey of the past month. What had begun as a desperate attempt to find one cat a temporary home had somehow catalyzed the transformation of an entire organization, and perhaps in small but meaningful ways, the community it served. The ground floor of the Blackburn house was even more suitable than Hollis had described. Its formal parlor would make an ideal office and meeting space. The former dining room could serve as a resource center for foster families and a classroom for volunteer training. The kitchen, updated with modern appliances while preserving its vintage charm, would be perfect for preparing special meals for animals with medical needs. As Marlowe moved from room to room, making notes and sketching rough floor plans, Quill conducted his own methodical exploration. He examined each windowsill with particular attention, as if assessing its potential as an observation post. In the front parlor, he finally selected a bay window overlooking Maple Street, jumping up and settling into a patch of late afternoon sunlight with evident approval. From this new perch, Quill could observe the rhythms of Maple Street, just as he had once watched Harper Street, the school bus passing at regular intervals, the mail carrier making his appointed rounds, neighbors walking dogs or pushing strollers along the tree-lined sidewalks. Different specifics, but the same essential pattern, a community going about its daily life, interconnected in ways both visible and invisible. It was this interconnectedness that Harbour Haven 2.0 would both rely upon and strengthen, the recognition that care and belonging were not confined to specific buildings, but existed in the relationships between people, animals, and the places they shared. On Tuesday, exactly 5 weeks after Marlowe had almost turned out the lights at Harbour Haven for what she thought was the final time, the new chapter officially began. A small gathering of key supporters assembled at the Maple Street property for an informal ribbon-cutting ceremony. Reverend Greer offered a brief blessing. Ria Yarrow presented a handmade sign created by her students. Keen Dillard recorded the proceedings for his morning show. Eliza Whitfield inspected the financial reports with approving nods. Hollis Pike stood somewhat awkwardly at the edges, his quiet pride visible in the way he watched Marlowe cut the ribbons strung across the front door. And Quill, as the guest of honor, received the privilege of being first to enter, which he did with his characteristic dignity, proceeding directly to his chosen windowsill, as if he had always belonged there. Later, after the small celebration had concluded and the various supporters had dispersed to their respective responsibilities, Marlowe sat in what would become Harbour Haven's new office, watching as Quill maintained his vigil by the window. Outside, the church bell began to toll noon, And right on cue, the recycling truck rumbled down Maple Street. Quill's attention sharpened, his ears swiveling forward to track these familiar sounds even in their new location. His whiskers twitched slightly as the final bell toll faded, his posture alert but relaxed, the perfect balance of attention and ease that had become his signature. Marlowe smiled, recognizing in his response something profound about adaptation and constancy. Quill had adjusted to each new environment, her apartment, the church office, the school library, and now this Maple Street headquarters, without losing his essential nature or abandoning the routines that anchored him. He remained himself, steady and watchful, while embracing the changes that circumstances required. It was a lesson Harbor Haven itself was learning, how to evolve without abandoning its core purpose, how to find new expressions of its mission within changing constraints. Different building, different model, same heart. As winter settled over Millfield in the weeks that followed, Harbor Haven 2.0 found its rhythm. The Maple Street headquarters became a hub of activity, foster family orientations, volunteer training sessions, adoption paperwork processing, and coordination of the various community programs that now comprised the shelter's distributed model. Quill, for his part, maintained a rigorous schedule that would have exhausted a less methodical cat. Mondays and Wednesdays found him at the senior center, where his therapy animal certification, achieved with remarkable ease given his natural temperament, allowed him to visit residents who had once kept pets of their own, but could no longer do so. Tuesdays and Thursdays were dedicated to the school reading program, which had expanded to include children from neighboring districts. Friday mornings he accompanied Marlowe to the local radio station, where Keane had established a popular weekly segment called Quill's Corner, highlighting animals available for adoption and community support opportunities. Weekends brought various community events, church gatherings, adoption fairs, educational presentations, at which Quill served as Harbor Haven's living ambassador, his steady presence a reminder of the quiet dignity that had captured Millfield's imagination and support when the shelter needed it most. Through it all, Quill maintained his daily ritual of observing the noon bell and recycling truck, regardless of his location. Staff at the senior center, school and radio station came to expect his prompt movement to the nearest window at 11:58 each day, his attentive posture as the familiar sounds marked midday across Millfield. One snowy Tuesday in early December, as Marlowe updated Harbor Haven's quarterly report in preparation for the board meeting, Eliza Whitfield having insisted on proper governance structures for the reorganized entity, she found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey of the past few months. The spreadsheet open on her laptop told part of the story: stable funding from program fees and regular donations, a growing network of foster homes reducing the need for physical housing space, successful adoptions facilitated through community partnerships, educational initiatives reaching more people than ever before. By any objective measure, Harbor Haven was not merely surviving but thriving in its new distributed form. But the numbers couldn't capture the less tangible transformations, the strengthened community connections, the sense of shared purpose that had emerged from near disaster, the ways in which Harbor Haven had become more deeply woven into Millfield's fabric. Nor could they reflect the personal changes Marlowe herself had experienced. The exhaustion and isolation that had marked her final months at the old shelter had given way to a renewed sense of purpose and connection. She was no longer trying to sustain Harbor Haven's mission alone, but was supported by a network of community partners who shared both the work and the vision. Most surprising of all had been the evolution of her relationship with Hollis Pike. What had begun as a practical arrangement, a plumber assessing a broken boiler, had gradually developed into something neither had anticipated. Their collaboration on Harbor Haven's transition had revealed shared values and complementary strengths. Professional respect had grown into friendship, and friendship into something more tentative but promising. Their first official date had been modest, coffee at the diner after a Harbor Haven board meeting. The second, a community concert where Hollis's baritone had featured prominently in the church choir's performance. By the third, dinner at Millfield's one upscale restaurant, they had acknowledged that whatever was developing between them deserved the space to grow at its own pace, much like Harbor Haven itself. Quill, with his characteristic adaptability, had accepted Hollis's increasing presence in their lives with dignified approval. He would now allow Hollis to stroke his head briefly, a privilege extended to very few humans, and had been known to settle near the man's feet during evening planning sessions at the Maple Street headquarters. A knock at the office door interrupted Marlowe's reflections. She looked up to find Calla Wynne standing in the doorway, her dark braids now adorned with red ribbons that matched her winter coat. "Ms. Finch? My mum said I could come say hi to Quill before our reading session," the child explained, her speech now fluent where once it had stumbled. "Is that okay?" "Of course," Marlowe smiled, glancing at the clock. Perfect timing. He just finished his morning nap. Quill, who had been dozing in a patch of winter sunlight on his windowsill, opened his eyes at the sound of Calla's voice. He stretched languidly before jumping down and approaching the girl with unhurried dignity. "Hi, Quill," Calla greeted him, kneeling to his level but not attempting to touch him. She had learned his preferences well over the months of their reading sessions. "I brought a new book today. It's about a cat who helps his whole town during a big storm. Ms. Chen said you might like it." Quill blinked slowly at her, a gesture Marlowe had come to recognize as his version of affection. He then turned and walked deliberately back to his windowsill, jumping up and settling into position with a clear expectation that Calla would join him. The girl needed no further invitation. She pulled a chair close to the window and opened her book, beginning to read in a clear, confident voice that bore little resemblance to the halting whisper of their first encounter. Watching them, the once shy child now reading comfortably, the once overlooked cat now valued and celebrated, Marlowe felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This was Harbour Haven's true purpose, distilled to its essence, creating connections that allowed both animals and humans to become their best selves. The noon bell began to toll, and Quill's attention shifted momentarily to the window. Right on schedule, the recycling truck rumbled down Maple Street, its familiar sound a counterpoint to Calla's reading. Quill observed its passing with his characteristic focus before returning his attention to the child and her story. In that moment, Marlowe understood something fundamental about the power of routine and presence. Quill's daily ritual of watching the bell and truck wasn't merely habit, it was a form of anchoring, a way of creating continuity amid change. By observing the same rhythms from different locations throughout Millfield, he had woven together the community's separate spaces into a single, coherent map of belonging. Harbour Haven had done something similar in its transition from a single building to a distributed network. What held it together wasn't walls or ownership, but shared purpose and consistent care, the same qualities that Quill embodied in his quiet, watchful way. As winter deepened and Millfield prepared for the holidays, Harbour Haven's story continued to unfold in ways both expected and surprising. The foster network expanded beyond initial projections. The therapy animal program grew to include 3 additional cats who showed promise for the work. The Maple Street headquarters became a gathering place not just for shelter business, but for community connection. And through it all, Quill maintained his routines with steadfast dignity, a living reminder that sometimes the most powerful force for change isn't dramatic action, but consistent presence. The willingness to sit and watch, to be fully present in each moment, to create, through simple reliability, a space where others can find their courage, their voice, their belonging. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside the windows of First Baptist Church, Marlowe sat in a pew midway back, Quill in a special carrier beside her. Hollis had saved them seats, arriving early after finishing the emergency repair that had delayed their original plans for the evening. The sanctuary was warm and fragrant, with pine boughs and candle wax. Familiar faces filled the pews, Rhea Yarrow and her husband, Keen Dillard with his teenage sons, Eliza Whitfield in her customary seat near the front, Mrs. Abernathy from the laundromat, and dozens of others who had become part of Harbour Haven's extended community over the past months. As the choir began the processional hymn, Hollis excused himself to join them, his deep baritone soon blending with the other voices in perfect harmony. Marlowe opened Quill's carrier door slightly, allowing him to watch the proceedings while remaining secure in his familiar space. From their vantage point, Millfield appeared as it truly was, not merely a collection of buildings and streets, but a living network of relationships. The same people who gathered in the church tonight would visit the laundromat tomorrow, shop at Osric Thatch's hardware store next week, attend school functions in the new year, tune in to Keen's morning show on their way to work. And through this web of connections, Harbour Haven now moved not as an isolated entity, but as an integrated thread, strengthening the whole, even as it was supported by it. Different building, different model, same heart, and perhaps a more sustainable and deeply rooted expression of its mission than had been possible before. As the service concluded, and congregants moved toward the fellowship hall for hot cider and cookies, Marlowe felt a gentle touch on her shoulder. Reverend Greer stood beside her pew, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Merry Christmas, Marlowe," he said warmly. "And to Millfield's most famous timekeeper as well." He nodded toward Quill, who regarded him with dignified attention from his carrier. "Merry Christmas, Thomas," Marlowe replied, "and thank you for everything these past months. I'm not sure we'd be here without your help at the beginning." Reverend Greer shook his head slightly. "I offered a meeting room and some encouragement. The rest was already there, waiting to emerge. The community connections, the innovative approaches, the willingness to evolve rather than simply end." His gaze shifted to Quill. "Sometimes we just need a reminder of what matters most." As they joined the flow of congregants moving toward refreshments and conversation, Marlowe reflected on the Reverend's words. Harbor Haven's transformation hadn't been a single dramatic rescue, but a series of small connections, each strengthening the next until a new pattern emerged, one that honored the shelter's history while creating space for its future. In the fellowship hall, Quill received his usual share of gentle attention from those who had followed his journey. Calla Wynne showed him the new book she had received as an early Christmas present. Eliza Whitfield approved his holiday bow tie with a dignified nod that mirrored his own mannerisms. Hollis, returned from choir duties, slipped him a small treat that Marlowe pretended not to notice. Later that night, as Marlowe and Hollis walked back to Maple Street through gently falling snow, Quill secure in his carrier between them, the quiet streets of Millfield seemed to hold a special kind of peace. Christmas lights glowed in windows, wreaths adorned doors, and the occasional sound of laughter or music drifted from homes where families gathered. At the Harbor Haven headquarters, now festively decorated with greenery and twinkling lights, they paused on the porch before entering. "Hard to believe where we were just a few months ago," Marlowe observed, looking up at the renovated Blackburn house that had become such a perfect home for Harbor Haven's next chapter. "Everything was ending, or so I thought," Hollis nodded, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Endings and beginnings," he reminded her, echoing his words from their final walkthrough of the old shelter. "Sometimes hard to tell apart until you've lived through them." Inside, as Marlowe released Quill from his carrier and Hollis stoked the fireplace that was one of the old house's many charms, the sense of rightness that had been growing over the past months settled into something solid and certain. Not because everything was perfect or all challenges resolved, but because they had found a sustainable rhythm, a way of being that honored both constancy and change. Quill, true to form, conducted a thorough inspection of the premises before settling on his favorite windowsill, his amber eyes reflecting the glow of the Christmas lights strung along the porch railing outside. From this vantage point, he could observe Maple Street in all its quiet, snowy beauty, a different view than Harper Street had offered, but observed with the same attentive gaze. As Marlowe and Hollis settled on the sofa nearby, mugs of hot cider warming their hands, Marlowe found herself contemplating the lesson at the heart of Harbor Haven's journey, a lesson Quill had embodied all along: the power of steady presence, the courage of showing up day after day, even when overlooked or undervalued, the wisdom of watching and waiting, of finding one's place not through dramatic gestures, but through consistent, reliable being. For anyone who had ever felt invisible in their own story, who had ever stood at the end of a line wondering if their turn would ever come, who had ever feared that their quiet contributions might go unnoticed, in a world that often rewarded noise and spectacle, Quill's story offered a gentle reassurance. Sometimes the most profound impact comes not from grand actions, but from simple, steady presence. Sometimes the light stays on not because of a miracle, but because someone refuses to give up, keeps showing up, maintains their watch even when it seems futile. And sometimes, in ways no one could have predicted, that quiet persistence becomes exactly the anchor a community needs to remember how to care for what is theirs. Outside, the church bell tolled midnight, marking Christmas Day's arrival across Millfield. Though the recycling truck was absent at this hour, Quill's ears swiveled forward to track the familiar sound, his posture alert yet relaxed, the perfect balance of attention and ease that had become his signature. Harbor Haven's lights would stay on, not just for another month or year, but for the foreseeable future. Different building, different model, same heart, and perhaps a more sustainable and deeply rooted expression of its mission than had ever been possible before. All because when that finger had hovered over the light switch one autumn evening, a single meow had cut through the silence and made a hand tremble as if the last cat was saying, "Not yet. The story isn't over. There's still work to be done, belonging to be found, connection to be woven. And in that moment of hesitation, in that decision to listen to one cat's quiet protest, everything had changed. Not in a flash of dramatic rescue, but in the steady, cumulative power of showing up day after day with unwavering attention to what matters most. The end.